Good morning, everybody. On what I hope is a sunny day near you. It's beautiful out here in Suffolk, where I live, and as all of you know, I'm Craig Eden Phillips. I'm the founder and convener of Social Club, which is the network for social leaders, chief execs, and founders of social purpose organisations. We've been meeting throughout the crisis online, as everybody has. Both to support each other, but also learn about how to cope with the crisis now, in the here and now, but also, and perhaps more importantly, look over the horizon to when the crisis is over, and think about what we're actually facing into the future. To that end, we've been trying to bring together, in the way that we do in Social Club, a range of interesting, challenging, and provoking external inputs. And with that in mind, I've asked David Laws to join us today. David Laws, you will remember probably from the coalition government. He served as chief secretary of the Treasury and as an education minister. But above and beyond that, he was deeply involved in the formation and the direction really of the coalition government. So he was a key figure. I've asked David to come on today for three reasons. I think one is that his command of the macroeconomic kind of situation that we're going to be going into is really, really high, and he understands that. He understands, secondly, the implications that this crisis will probably have on public spending, and the ramifications that fall out of that for all organisations dealing with the state. And I think the third reason I asked David to come on is that he's now one of us. He's a chief exec of a social purpose organisation, the Institute Institute for Education, whose name I've slightly got wrong, but David will correct me. And so he's got a brilliant line of sight on the issues that we face. So I just want to, just in terms of format, what we're going to do is I'm going to hand the floor to David in a second, and he's going to talk for 15, maybe 20 minutes on a pre-agreed brief. Subsequent to that, I'd like any questions and observations you've got to be put through on chat. I will then convene the conversation and bring you in from chat. If I don't see you on chat, I can't bring you in. So make yourself known on chat if you can, and I'll bring the conversation and round to you as soon as possible. If you keep contributions to maybe a minute and a half, I think any more on this format tends to grate. So if you could just be as succinct as you can in your points and questions for David, that would be fantastic. And we'll take probably one at a time. We've still got a few people coming on, which is fantastic. So I don't know what numbers we're up to, Joe, but I think we're well in the 20s, 30s
28.
now, I think. 28. There'll be about 40 probably by the time we're going. If you do need to leave, just slip off. But we're running till just after 10 to 11, and we're going to be putting David's stuff on the webinar afterwards as well, but not for questions. So feel free to say or ask whatever you like without any worry about that coming through later. Right, that's enough from me. So I'd just like to hand over to David Laws, and just thank you for coming on at what's purely a busy time for you, David. The floor is yours. Welcome to Social Club.
Inviting me on this morning, and as you mentioned, I chair two education organisations that are both charities and that are both impacted in different ways by the current crisis. One's called the Education Policy Institute, which is a UK-focused research organisation that does quantitative research into education policies and data, and the other is called the Education Partnerships Group, and that actually operates in Africa and the rest of the developing world, helping governments there to improve the quality of their education systems for the poorest children in some of the poorest countries. So we obviously face challenges both operating in the UK and in particular with our international work. But you've asked me to say a little bit about what's happening to the economy, then what's happening to the public finances, and then go on to look forward for what it means for our sector. So it's worth starting by noting that the response to the virus by governments across the world has led to what looks like the biggest and fastest fall in economic activity globally in recorded economic history. And perhaps that's not surprising, because governments have deliberately made a policy choice to close down large parts of their economy in order to protect them from a bulge in cases that their health services could simply not cope with. And this has also been a globalized crisis where the virus has spread very, very rapidly around the world, with the extent of travel that there now is, touching really every population centre of any size. And of course, governments, learning from each other, have tended fairly swiftly to take similar actions to close down their economies and societies to prevent the virus spreading. So I suppose the thing that we saw first was very big declines in stock markets of between 30 and 40% around the world. We've seen a bit of recovery from that already to declines of 20 or 30%, but still enormous by any standards. And now that the stock markets, financial markets are stabilizing and hoping that the virus is close to turning the corner in terms of numbers of cases, we're beginning to see the delayed impact on the real economy. We've only got a taste of this so far, given that the shutdown has only gone on for a short period of time, and there's always a lag in economic data being released. But most strikingly, we've seen in the United States weekly claims for joblessness, for benefits, essentially go up from their previous level of about 200,000 to 250,000 per week to record 10 million jobless claims in the last 2 weeks that we've seen. So there's clearly been a massive increase in unemployment in the US, and we may not have seen the end of that yet as people find their way through registering. We don't have comparable data in the UK, but we've seen a big increase in universal credit claims, about 1 million extra claims registered to date, and that figure likely to go higher. And we saw last week some of the survey data across Europe about the economies indicating the direction of travel, including the purchasing managers surveys that were released across a lot of countries. These are measured on a 0 to 100 scale, where 50 is the dividing point between growth and recession. And they normally range from 40, indicating a recession, to 60, which is sort of boom time activity. Italy last week, their purchasing manager index had fallen to 17, which is a level that we've simply never seen before since these surveys were introduced. So all of this suggests, unsurprisingly, that that many economies will have seen quite a negative impact to growth in Q1 of this year, but that the really big hit will be in the second quarter of this year, where we're likely to see declines in the size of the economy at the fastest rate on record since reliable statistics were introduced. And then, of course, the forecasters are predicting or hoping that in the third and fourth quarters of the year, there'll be some bounce back in activity if economies manage to reopen or partly reopen. In response to all of this, we've seen enormous stimulus packages across the world, varying in size tremendously from nation to nation, and varying a lot in terms of design characteristics. So in the UK, the government's introduced the job retention scheme that pays 80% of people's salaries if they're on pay as you earn, and under certain circumstances, a similar percentage for self-employed. In the US, they've gone with principally a fiscal stimulus package that sends a check to most households, which gets money simply and quickly, but will also be targeting households not impacted by the crisis, and notably doesn't give the same incentives to employers to retain staff. So these are quite interesting economic experiments, really, that economists will be looking at with great interest to see whether the different policy responses lead to different outcomes. And there's a risk that the European countries will do a better job of protecting jobs, and that the US will see a bigger increase in unemployment. Obviously, the size of the growth impact and the impact on the public finances and consumer spending depends entirely on the length of the shutdown. Governments are going to be very keen to reopen their societies and economies as soon as they safely can, but they simply don't know yet how quickly they can do that safely. I think the assumption, looking at the experience of China, is that you may need something like 3 months from going into a lockdown situation to coming out of a lockdown situation, and that suggests that we could possibly be coming out in the United Kingdom from early June onwards. But the truth is, nobody really knows. All parts of government are looking essentially to the health advisors, and health advisors are dealing with a crisis of a type that they've never seen before. So nobody knows for certain what is going to happen. It does seem highly likely that looking at the experience of other countries and thinking about the policy challenges, that when society is reopened, it will be reopened on a sort of phased, staggered basis, so that you might get some businesses being allowed to reopen. You could possibly get schools going back after the summer half term. I think there is a possibility of that. But we should expect continued controls around social distancing, around large meetings, more home working for employees who can go on home working beyond the lockdown, and more of a focus on the protection of vulnerable groups rather than the whole of society being locked down. And what none of us really know, and nobody knows in government, is whether that unravelling of the lockdown can be safely achieved, or whether we'll get fresh outbursts of the virus that will then force governments to go back into further lockdowns. That would be very economically disruptive, and is something that governments will want to avoid, which is why I suppose they could err a little bit on the side of continuing the lockdowns for a bit longer to try to extinguish as much of the virus in each country as possible. All of this will obviously have very, very significant impacts on the public finances in all affected countries. Tax revenue will decline of its own volition as people are laid off or receive smaller salaries. There are a lot of government schemes to defer taxes. They are monumentally expensive schemes, like the government's furloughing scheme, that will essentially nationalise large parts of the employment sector of the economy. There's the consequence of spending extra money on the NHS and other emergency services. And there are other spending pressures that we will see, including on the benefits system. So I think you could probably describe this as more or less the perfect fiscal storm. This is all the worst things that could happen to the public finances happening at the same time. In 2010, when the coalition started, we had a deficit on the public finances of about 10% of GDP. About £160 billion was the gap between spending and tax revenues. We spent the next 10 years trying to reduce that deficit to a couple of percent of GDP. It now seems likely that all of the gains made in reducing the deficit between 2010 and 2020 will more than unravel in a few months. And the Treasury now fears that the deficit for the coming financial year that we've just started could be in the order of 10 to 20% of GDP. So that's a very big figure, but actually the bandwidth of uncertainty is also telling as well. You will never find another circumstance where a treasury of any country estimates a deficit to the extent of having a band of 10% of its national economy being the range of uncertainty. And that's why, that's because the Treasury doesn't know how rapidly the economy can get back to normality. But we do know that with costs of that order of magnitude, Treasuries will be keen to wind down some of their economic support as soon as they safely can and as soon as they see economies have rebounded. So how will government respond to this big increase in the deficit and debt? Well, I suppose that depends a lot on whether governments see this as a one-off hit to debt as a consequence of large numbers of us essentially taking a 3-month holiday, or actually, I suppose I shouldn't say I'm taking a 3-month holiday, because like many of us, I'm continuing to work. but essentially government has decided that quite a lot of the economy needs to go into shutdown for 2 or 3 months, and that is going to have the equivalent economic effect of losing a large proportion of output in the current quarter, and therefore raising debt. If that was just a one-off phenomenon, then the government probably wouldn't panic too much, given these very extraordinary economic circumstances, and also that interest rates are tremendously low. So even though debt will go up, the annual cost to the Chancellor of bearing that extra debt burden will be manageable, because interest rates are now incredibly low, much lower than they were in 2010, even when the sort of 10-year yield on government bonds was 4%. It's now barely 0.5%. However, if the impact on the economy lasts longer than a quarter, then we are going to have a bigger hit to our deficit, and we could have a number of so-called scarring impacts on the economy. So some previously profitable firms may go to the wall. Unemployment will go up, but may not come down fully after 3 or 4 months. Consumers will have had a period of time where their incomes may have dropped in some cases, where they've had to take pay cuts or work for fewer days, and that will impact on consumer expenditure. People will have postponed mortgage and other repayments that they'll then have to restart again. And all of that will be exacerbated if we go through multiple periods of lockdown and then reopening, followed by lockdown. So at the moment, it's uncertain what the government's fiscal response is going to be. Their immediate response clearly is to allow debt and borrowing to take the strain. They've already announced massive increases in government borrowing over the next few months, and with some indication that the Bank of England might be willing to do what it would normally not want to do and buy government bonds directly from the government. It seems to me that there probably, in spite of the increase in debt and borrowing, isn't going to be a huge appetite for dealing with this response by more austerity of the 2010 to 2020 variant. The truth is that we drove out a lot of the easier savings that could be made in that period of austerity. It's now much less easy to see how we're going to not expand public spending in areas such as the National Health Service, which is of itself going to be under pressure because of the current crisis. And there is probably going to be limited public appetite for a second decade of austerity after what's been happening since 2010. Indeed, what's happened since the period of economic crisis started in 2007 with the collapse of a lot of the financial markets. So as a consequence, we're probably going to be in for a long period of much higher borrowing than the government would otherwise have targeted. And the government, once it feels the economy has sufficiently bounced back, is probably going to need to use tax rises as well as constraint on public expenditure to bring the deficit down. But that won't be popular, and those tax rises will probably have to be delayed until the government is confident that the economy has rebounded sufficiently, which probably won't be this year and may well not be next year, but it could be the years after that. And that will obviously, in and of itself, suppress consumer demand, which means that although we may not be in for another decade of equivalent public sector austerity, we could be in for another decade of very high borrowing, higher rates of taxation, and suppressed consumer demand. So in relation to challenges for the sorts of organisations we are running, obviously there's massive variation by type of organisation. Those that are public facing and in touch with the public and need to be in touch with the public in order to operate will have seen very, very big impacts over a short period of time. Others that are less public facing may be able to carry on their activities for a period of time without serious immediate effect. Obviously, the government has introduced a number of schemes that help. Some of those involve allowing people to borrow money, which many organisations like ours won't want to do because it will build up problems for later down the track. But there are opportunities to delay some tax payments and to furlough staff, transferring 80% of the costs up to a certain cap to the government. I think it's worth noting that because the close down of the economy is so expensive, and because the government will therefore not want these schemes to go on forever because of the cost reasons, there is some incentive for businesses and charities that are going to use these schemes to use these rapidly, even if their short-term financial pressures don't seem that great, because these schemes are more likely to be generous now and then are likely to taper away in the future. So even if you have an organisation that says, well, things are not too bad now, the main effect would be in 6 months or 9 months or a year's time, I think there is an incentive to think about using these schemes now to protect finances now, given that actually what many businesses may find is that the challenge doesn't come immediately, but as consumers and others make decisions in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months time, resulting in lower amounts of income. And I think for many, although many businesses have been dramatically hit very quickly, a lot of others won't or haven't noticed the impact so far and are more likely to be impacted in the next calendar year than this year. And I think it's very important not, therefore, to be complacent about thinking that these are just short-term impacts, or that opportunities to cushion income shouldn't be taken now because things don't seem to be too bad now. Those types of organisations need to keep their finances as strong as possible for this year, so that if things get bad next year, there is at least some cushion. So obviously sensible savings can be made where there are discretionary expenditures that it now isn't necessary to make, and scrutinising all costs to see whether they really are necessary in the current environment or whether they can be delayed makes good sense. So I think, Craig, that's probably
brilliant.
Probably more than you actually wanted in terms of
no,
time.
It's perfect. No, that's perfect. That's
probably worth stopping there and just taking any questions.